Hey, welcome back to Chapter 4. We're on Part 2 now. We're going to continue our discussion of measures of central tendency by discussing the median and the mode, and then we'll wrap up with the most important part, which is when to use which measure of central tendency, which depends on what kind of data you have and what kind of distributions you have. Let's dive in. All right, let's talk about the median. So, as I mentioned earlier, the median is defined as a value where 50% of the scores in the distribution are above that value and 50% of the scores in the distribution are below that value. It's not as common of a measure as the mean or the average for a particular variable, but it's really useful if a distribution is very skewed. When you're calculating the median, you have to arrange the list of all scores from lowest to greatest. And if you have an odd number of total scores, you just find whatever the middle value is. So in this little white box at the upper end is an example where there's 7 total scores ranging from 1 to 9, and you just look at it once they're arranged in numerical order and you say, oh, the middle score, which is the median, is 6. But if you have an even number of scores after you've arranged them in numerical order, then you take the two middle scores and you average those, which means you just add them together and divide by 2, essentially. And so, I'm from a family that has 6 children. I have 5 brothers and sisters. So I'm one of the middle. I'm not the middle. And so you'd have to, if you wanted to calculate the median score of the siblings' ages in my family, then you would add me and my older brother and divide those scores by 2 to find the median age. Now we'll move on to the last measure of central tendency, which is the mode. Does anybody remember Depeche Mode? They were an electronic band in the 80s, and I think I've only ever heard one of their songs. But So the mode, as you all know, is just the most common or most frequent score in a distribution. So if you're looking at a histogram, which is a frequency distribution graph like this, all you do is you find the highest peak or the highest bar, and that's the mode because it's literally telling you that's the score of whatever variable you're looking for that the most people in your sample got. And so let's say, on the x-axis here, maybe this is number of free throws successfully made in a 30-second period. I'm just making this up. And it looks like a lot of people made 11 free throws successfully in 30 seconds, about 55 total people. So the y-axis in this case is frequency. That's just absolute numbers of people or observations or whatever. If it was percent, then it would be 55%, but that wouldn't make sense because this wouldn't all add up to 100%. So that doesn't make sense. But anyways, you get the gist. Look for the highest peak, and that is the mode. I just want to mention that frequency distribution graphs, also known as histograms, um, sometimes they're shown without the actual bars, without the actual bars, but they'll still have like scores on the x-axis. This one doesn't, but just to get used to seeing the fact that you might just see curves. Imagine that there are many bars underneath the curve that you can't actually see, but we're gonna see distributions like this, presented like this a lot throughout the semester. So just get used to that for sure. But mode is kind of unique amongst the measures of central tendency because there can be multiple modes for one distribution. There's only ever one average, one mean, or one median for a distribution, but there can be many modes. So you can see on the left-hand side here, a unimodal distribution only has one peak, but there could be bimodal distributions where there are two different peaks, or even multimodal, many peaks in a distribution, and you report all of them in those cases, which is different from the other measures. If you're going to calculate this stuff by hand, which we never will throughout the semester, but if you did, you would arrange all the numbers in numeric order and then figure out just simply by counting how many repetitions of a particular score you get, which one is the most common score. Or sometimes, like in this example, there will be two of the most common score, 3 and 9. Lastly, we'll talk about how the three measures of central tendency compare in different distributions, which we've already talked about a little bit, and importantly, which measure of central tendency to use when describing different types of distributions. So if I am, a student who is seeing distributions for the first time and I'm trying to look at descriptive statistics for particular variables in a data set, how do I know which measure of central tendency to actually report? Well, the answer is it depends. And mostly what it depends on is the shape of the distribution. And the only way you would know about this is if for every variable you're interested in, you would actually in SPSS create a histogram for that variable to actually see the distribution of scores in your sample. So a symmetrical distribution like we talked about is really nice because the mean, median, and mode are all the same number, and then you just typically use the mean because it's the most commonly reported and people understand mean very intuitively. But if you have a very skewed distribution, then the median is actually more representative of kind of the typical value. The mean gets pulled out too far by outliers. As an example, here's kind of a strange distribution of test scores from your book, and what it's showing is that most people on this test got either an 80 or an 82 percentage on the exam. And so if you calculate the mean, it comes out to be 78.67% out of 100, and the median turns out to be 80% of a score on the exam. And so you have to ask yourself, well, which one of those is more representative or typical in the data? And it's like, well, more people, meaning the higher column, the higher bar, shows up for people who scored 80% or 82%. And so the median actually better represents the data. The reason why the mean is lower is because you can see there's a couple of people who scored pretty low in the 50s of percentages or low 60s. So it gets pulled to the left a little bit. So your book is suggesting that the median is probably the better way to go in this example. We also want to think about the type of data, the scale of measurements, like we talked about a couple of chapters ago, because the mode is preferred when you only have nominal data. This is really, really, really important. If you have just lists of people's political affiliation or religious preferences or gender, you can't create averages or medians of those things. They don't make any sense. So you want to just have a mode, which is just, well, most of the sample is female, or most of the, whatever percentage of this sample is Christian, and whatever percent is Hindu, and whatever percent is Buddhist, etc., etc., right? You can't average those categories together because that doesn't make any sense. The mode is also preferred when there's many modes in the distribution, whereas median is preferred again when the data is ordinal, also when it's open-ended, because you can see if responses are like 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 or more hours. That's an indication that it's open-ended, 6 or more hours. That means that there's probably going to be some heavy outliers. And so the mean isn't going to be as good for that type of data. But the mean is preferred when the data is interval or ratio and, an emphasis on and, the distribution is symmetrical or at least relatively symmetrical. And here's a really handy flowchart on how to decide which measure of central tendency to use based on the particular data that you have. All right, let's finish up with some review. So when the data is nominal, meaning categorical, or when the data is bimodal, suggesting there's two different modes, what is the preferred measure of central tendency? Pause the video and make a guess. You bet, it's the mode. Anytime you see multiple modes in a distribution, or when the data is only categorical or nominal, you have to go with mode. What if the data is interval or ratio and the distribution is relatively symmetrical? Then what is the preferred measure of central tendency? Then you want to go with the mean, which is definitely the most commonly used measure of central tendency. And you might guess this by process of elimination, but when the data is skewed, what is the preferred measure of central tendency? Yep, I bet you got this one. It's the median. So when we're talking about things like income or other maybe open-ended questions that are probably going to generate a lot of outliers, then you definitely want to go with the median. All right, we did it. Thanks for hanging in there. Hope this was informative, and I will see you in the next lecture.